Welcome everyone to our weekly Zoom news conference. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, our briefing explores what it will take for communities hit hardest by the pandemic to heal. As the United States begins to open up, experts question whether herd immunity can be achieved. But what about the growing equity gaps, separating low-income communities of color from the rest of America? We are honored to welcome Manuel Pastor of the University of Southern California, one of the most respected scholars of social change in the country, and Leslie Johnson, Vice President of Organizational Development at the Community Coalition, a leading community-based organization in South Los Angeles, which has shifted increasingly from research and advocacy to service. I want to thank our briefing coordinators, Pilar Marrero, Sunita Sarabji, Anthony Advincula, and Tanu Henry, and our interpreters, Oscar Arteta and Jackie No, for providing simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and Korean. We ask our presenters to speak slowly for our interpreters. If you speak too fast, our moderator may interrupt you to ask you to slow down. We invite reporters to please enter questions in the chat box. We will take questions for each speaker and again at the conclusion of the panel. And of course, we'll be sending a video and related material to all our attendees following the conclusion of the conference. Now I'm turning the microphone over to today's moderator, Pilar Marrero.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Well, Sandy said it all. We are on our way to healing, we hope, from the pandemic. But there are other areas in our communities that need to be healed. So without further ado, we'll give the floor to Professor Manuel Pastor. He is Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity and Turpanjian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change at the University of Southern California. Professor, welcome.
Good to be with you, and I will indeed try to speak slow, although this is a very difficult thing for people who know me. I'm actually Cuban American, although I grew up in Southern California, and our Spanish is muy rápidamente cuando nosotros hablamos. We speak incredibly rapidly, and as my wife said, from my family, she hadn't realized that Spanish actually had consonants. Because nosotros hablamos también comiendo toda la palabra. We speak very rapidly, eating all of the words. So I will try to be clear in English in a way that is casi imposible, almost impossible in my Spanish. We know about COVID, that COVID is the disease that has revealed our illnesses as a society, that it's a little bit like the valleys of inequality that pre-existed COVID have been flooded with the tsunami of the disease. And the vulnerabilities we had with regard to the precarity of employment, with regard to over-incarceration and those congregate settings, with regard to essential work that is treated as though it is disposable, with regard to mixed status families threatened by systems that they feel unable to tap into, that we have seen the tremendous pre-existing conditions of inequality be exacerbated by COVID. And we've seen that happen at multiple points along the way. And I want to talk about that for what we're looking for going forward. When the pandemic first broke into the public consciousness in mid-March of last year, I wrote an op-ed by the end of March talking about how this was going to severely impact the immigrant community because of the over-indexing in essential work, because of the overcrowded conditions that so many immigrants and Black Americans face, and because of the reluctance, particularly of mixed status families, to tap into systems that might be able to benefit them going forward. The government was saying that COVID testing would be available to you, even if you lacked legal status, but this was the same government that was eager to deport you and your grandmother, so it's pretty hard to develop a level of trust. So this is something I warned about back in the beginning of the pandemic. In the summer, I was talking about the ways in which this was clearly moving into communities of color, working class communities, and yet we had not moved our testing and outreach into those communities. I was a member of the governor's in California task force on jobs and business recovery, and I remember literally screaming in a meeting, which apparently you can also do on Zoom. We know that we can do it in person, but we can scream on Zoom too, about how irresponsible the state was being, because you could know from the beginning that this was going to ravage Black and Latino communities and Pacific Islander communities. That was showing up in the data. And the state, as you know, if you were paying attention, developed a health equity metric, which required that test positivity rates in communities that were in the lowest quartile, something called the California Healthy Places Index, which looks at basically social vulnerability, that be near the county average before counties were allowed to open up. And at the beginning of the vaccine rollout, I was saying that the vaccine rollout, while it looked equal, was clearly inequitable, that it was open to anyone of a certain age category or occupation category. By the way, that was unequal, because if you look at the age categories, overwhelmingly white. If you look at the younger populations, more people of color. So it's a recipe for racial inequality. But you could argue that everyone in that age category had an equal shot at getting a shot, as long as they had a computer, high-speed internet, the technological sophistication to put an automatic refresher on their browser, the kind of job where they could take 3 hours off in the middle of the day to chase down a vaccine, and access to a car rather than mass transit, so they could show up at Dodger Stadium, which was our favorite mega site here, or the mega sites wherever you exist, which were mostly dependent on private transportation. So really equal, but completely inequitable if you were on the wrong side of the digital divide, if you were on the wrong side of employment quality, meaning you didn't have a job you could zoom into, you had a job you had to show up to, and it was low wage, so giving up some work was not in your financial cards and not something your employer would allow, and you're on the wrong side of transit independence. I screamed a lot about that at the state level, and fortunately for us in the state, and I know Leslie can talk a little bit about this, what happened was the state of California made a pivot and said, well, you've got to put the vaccines, 40% of the vaccines, into the 25% of the communities that are scoring worse on this California Healthy Places Index. And they moved then quite rapidly to community clinics, such as one I hope that Leslie will talk about. That was a bit of a model, with mobile clinics, with mobilizing trusted messengers, and relying on things like health promoter or promotora campaigns, or relying on trusted community-based organizations to mobilize people to get to the vaccines. So I say all that only to say I've been right a lot along the way. So I would like you to consider that when I talk about something that I think is really important, which is the need for us to think 3 or 4 months ahead. I, in March of 2000, said this was going to really ravage immigrants. I was thinking a couple of months ahead. I was arguing about how this was in our Black and Latino communities in the state a couple of months ahead. And I was talking about vaccine inequity even as the system was being set up. So what am I thinking about now when I think 3 or 4 months ahead? What I think about now is the damage that has been done to our low-income communities, communities of color, and how we need to pre-position resources in the same way we should have been pre-positioning testing, and in the same way we should have been pre-positioning transit access, and in the same way we should have been pre-positioning vaccines. Because as we, as a society, emerge from this, what it's going to mean is that those of us who've been the most privileged is, maybe we're going to be able to keep going to work and go to a restaurant. But the big thing that's going to happen, I keep imagining those zombie apocalypse films where at the end, like the doors open up and people come crawling out to look at the world that's changed. Well, when people come crawling out, the economic damage that's going to have been done to Black and Latino communities is sharp. And we need to be talking about that, highlighting the loss of income, the loss of employment, the loss of wages, and arguing to pre-position the economic relief there. The job readiness activities, the relief programs. I mean, for example, in particular for mixed status families, we've got families that until the passage of the American Relief Act were essentially locked out of federal relief funds. And even now are kind of reluctant to tap in because they're worried that if they tap in, that may count against them if there's eventually a route to legalization in the future. So huge economic damage. There's huge educational damage because when we were looking at this at the beginning of the crisis, and I think Leslie will remember some of the data that we presented, when we locked down in LA County, for example, 13% of white kids who were in K through 12, when they went home, they lacked a computer and high-speed internet. They were on the wrong side of the digital divide. But that figure for Black and Latino kids was around 36 to 40%. So no matter the fact that they've gotten some Chromebooks and a hotspot, they're in a situation where there's been tremendous lost learning. They're the most reluctant to come back. My wife is the superintendent of a school district that's almost entirely Latino and Black, and about 85 to 90% free and reduced price lunch. They've got a rate of people going back to school that's quite low because people they've personally been affected by COVID in a way that makes them scared of sending their kids back to a place where the disease might be caught. So we've got to forward position educational resources. We could talk a little bit more about, I think we should be having a massive expansion in summer school. I think there's some reasons why that's probably not going to happen. But what we need for next year, lots of pre-K, lots of tutoring, lots of assistance at the high school level, and it needs to go to the communities that have been the most affected. We need to think about the health damage that's been caused. There's a lot of COVID long haulers, and those COVID long haulers are going to be most pronounced in communities that have experienced the disease the most, and where there was distrust of the local, where people couldn't access some of the health programs because of a lack of insurance, particularly for undocumented immigrants, or there's simply distrust and fear. And so there's going to be a lot of health damage. The one thing I really want to lift up is the mental health damage. You know, I'm relatively privileged. I'm a professor, been able to kind of zoom a lot of my work in. And I know that things have been tough for me, but for communities and families which have experienced direct loss of family members, who have felt the insecurity of whether or not income is going to be sufficient, who have been torn between the need to go to work and the need to stay healthy, who have felt like the government has betrayed them and not paid attention to their needs. The level of mental health trauma, and Leslie, I'm sure you're seeing this very directly at Community Coalition, is incredible. And we need to forward position culturally relevant and culturally sensitive mental health resources. And I put that emphasis on mental and culturally relevant and culturally sensitive and proficient because, you know, this is ethnic media. Let's admit it, in our communities, mental health is often viewed as something that should be dealt with in an isolated fashion. You're brutalized by a system, but you should be dealing with that trauma on your own. Or we think that people should just toughen up and make their way through it. So we understand that we need people of color, people from these communities who can talk to our communities about mental health, destigmatize it, make it seen as something that's social and community level and not just your individual failing, so that people feel confident accessing those resources. So I guess what I'm asking journalists to do is to also think 3 or 4 months ahead. There's some compelling stories right now about vaccine and vaccine inequality and what's going on. And surely you should be reporting on them. But we need to be thinking 3 or 4 months ahead at the traumas that communities will face and develop the kind of long form journalism, even if it's long form video and long form blogs and things like that, that dig in deep and really reveal what's going on and help to compel public action. Because as much as COVID has revealed, it has also compelled us to address inequality and inequity going forward as researchers, as community organizers, and as journalists. So that's what I wanted to tee up the conversation. Back to Pilar, who I think will bring Leslie in.
We're going to take a few questions now that what you said is fresh in our minds. This morning when I was watching President Biden's press conference talking about the jobs report, which wasn't as good as they expected. So we did gain jobs, but not as expected. I don't know who was expecting it. There was the first question he got from one reporter, I don't know what reporter it was do you think that this report means that the supplemental unemployment benefit was too much and that people are not taking the jobs because you gave them too much money? Essentially, that was the question. I had a reaction. I won't say it here, but what's your take, Professor Pastor, about this attitude that seems to point to the fact that many in the media and others believe that, oh, we're done, we're moving on, everyone's fine, we are fine, therefore all communities should be fine?
There's a lot in that question. including the fact that, Pilar, I saw your tweet, which was basically that Biden should have said to the reporter, well, maybe we should cut your salary so you could work a little harder. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. I want to say a couple things about that. There's a lot of benefit from being close to community, and there's a lot of gaps that can be created when you're a reporter based in DC and you don't actually know a lot of poor unemployed people, so you can imagine that they actually don't want to work. And I think that that's part of what that's reflecting. Now, I don't know how many of you watch Fox News. I will admit that I do. I work out on my elliptical in the morning, and so I managed to tune from station to station. I try to stay on Fox News for, as long as I can before I throw up, so that I can actually learn something. And I don't know whether you've been following, but the last couple of days they begin every show with, something about Biden being horrible. And they end every show recently this week finding restaurant operators, trying to talk to them about the problems they're having hiring people. And they show for each state, what the unemployment benefit is, and then they show the wages. And what they want the restaurant store owners to do is to say, yeah, the problem is unemployment benefits. But you know what? It turns out the restaurant owners and managers don't say that. They say, no, it's not unemployment. It's that it's like unsafe work, that people are thinking that they might look for better work. We really value the employees that we've got. We think they should be making more money. So for an entire week, Fox has been trying to trick a restaurant owner into saying that wages ought to be lower. They haven't found a guinea pig yet. Godspeed, maybe they will. The evidence doesn't suggest that that's what's going on. And many of you know, even if currently those unemployment benefits are sufficient to entice someone to want to stay at home, most people know they're not going to last forever, and that it makes sense to get your toehold in a labor market right now so that you can actually have that job. So that specific issue has really been angering me, Bilal, because it shows how detached reporters are from real people. And it also, I'm an economist, and I have the distinct disadvantage of looking at evidence, and when there's no evidence to support a position, suspecting that it's not there. But I do think that you're pointing to a big problem. And the big problem is that those people who've been able to, this is the other story you should be paying attention to. Normally, when we talk about a recession, it's what's called macroeconomic. It affects the whole economy. It affects a lot of people. And in 2008, 2009, yes, there were inequalities in that recession. But if you were a construction worker, you lost your job. If you were a manufacturing worker, you lost your job. But if you were a real estate agent, you lost your job. If you were in the finance industry, you lost your job. The stock market slept and rich people lost money. Housing prices fell and upper middle class people lost assets. That was more like a recession we're used to, which is, yes, it's unequal, but kind of everything went down, then everything went up. What is different about this recession is not so much a macro recession as a micro recession. Stock market's up, property values are at an all-time high. People who make more than $100,000 a year have basically suffered almost no loss in income or employment. Tech employment is absolutely back where it was. But if you were at the bottom of the labor market, if you were Black, female, immigrant, you got nailed. And inequalities have sharply increased. That is what is different about this recession. That is what looking at aggregate employment numbers tells you nothing about. We need to be looking at who's gaining, who's losing. And because so many of the people who write the news are themselves more in the upper middle class, talking to upper middle class people. The big story is that they can go back to restaurants again, and not that your garment factory hasn't gone back up and you're worried every time you go in about the protections that will be there or not be there.
Professor, Sunita wants to ask a question regarding vaccine inequality.
Dr. Pastor, I have a question about the vaccines themselves. Most community clinics are just administering the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which has a 66% efficacy rate versus the Pfizer and Moderna, which have a much higher efficacy rate. So are we essentially creating an underclass of people who are getting these vaccines? Are we making low-income people and people of color who are getting their vaccines at community clinics more vulnerable to getting infected?
You need to unmute, Professor.
Thank you. That's a great question, Sunita. Do you remember how at the beginning I gave you all those, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so? Back in December, chase it through my tweets, I was talking about how we needed to talk more about the difference between the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the other two vaccines in terms of equity, because it certainly was going to create the impression that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is less efficacious at preventing disease, but equally efficacious at preventing hospitalization and severe disease, that it was going to have the image of being a second-class vaccine and lead to resistance. You know, my best read of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that it's a very important tool that we need to take advantage of. Why? By the way, I will say that I did Pfizer and Pfizer. My wife, I think, did Pfizer and Pfizer. My son did Johnson & Johnson. The thing I think that's really important about Johnson & Johnson is that the one shot and done is really good for agricultural workers who are mobile. It's hard to get a second shot to. It's really good for homeless folks, unhoused folks who are hard to track. It's very good for folks who, you have to do a lot of outreach to get them out of their house. It's very good, surprisingly, for people who are just scared of shots. So there's actually a lot of use to it, and its efficacy, again, it's not strictly comparable, because when Pfizer and Moderna were being tested, there was a lot less vaccine, a lot less COVID out there. When Johnson & Johnson was being tested, it was being tested when there was a COVID surge, and it was being tested in South Africa, Brazil, and the United States. So it's probably more efficacious than we think. But what should we have been doing? We should have been doing a public relations campaign in December and January before it got emergency use authorization, so it could not get cast as a second-class vaccine, but rather as a kind of choice for those who face different circumstances.
Thank you, Professor. And let me bring in our second speaker, Leslie Johnson. She's Vice President of Organizational Development at Community Coalition in South Los Angeles. Welcome, Leslie. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, thank you, Pilar. Thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to share with you all. I have okay, that's better, good. I have a presentation, just a few slides. I'll share my screen if that's okay. Let's see here, I like a visual. All right. Okay, can folks see that? The logo? Okay, so my name's Leslie Johnson. I'm with Community Coalition. Last year we celebrated our 30th anniversary, so we're very proud of that. 30 years of stepping up for South Los Angeles. The headlines, since I'm speaking to reporters, I thought the headlines that I wanted to share is, for one, that racism is the true pandemic that we're fighting against, and that COVID-19 has exacerbated a lot of pre-existing conditions in our community, and that that are fostered by racism, institutional racism and white supremacy, and that we must call for solutions that are bold, that are systemic, not just individual level, but systems level, and that address the root causes. So yes, it's important to pay attention to symptoms and to address those, but to really solve a problem, we need to get down to its root. So just wanted to share a little bit about Community Coalition. We're a local organization. We're in South Los Angeles. Excuse me. We were founded back in 1990 in the wake of the crack cocaine epidemic. So there was just a lot of economic, health devastation in our community. And our organization was founded at that time. It was founded by Congressmember Karen Bass, who's you may be familiar with. She's a member of Congress, and she was also vetted for the office, to be Joe Biden's running mate last year. So you might have learned about her in that context. Our organization is a community organizing institution. And I put versus service delivery, just to be clear about the way that we approach problems or issues in our community. Our main strategy is to bring the people who are most impacted, bring them together to leverage their power towards creating change and towards getting what they want and deserve in their community. We do some service delivery, but we're not a service provider organization. We're an organizing institution. And our other strategy that we employ is policy advocacy. So again, looking to create and help promote solutions that can impact thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people at once, to have broad impact. Also, something that I think is unique about our organization is that we're a multiracial and multi-generational organization.
Leslie, please talk a little bit slower for the interpreters.
Okay. Sure. So multiracial and multi-generational. When the organization was founded, South Los Angeles was a predominantly African-American community, but it was in the midst of a demographic shift. And so today, South LA is a predominantly Latino community, but it's a Black and Brown community. And then our organization places a premium on creating multi-racial unity. And that's not something that just kind of happens. It needs to be worked at. And we're also a multi-generational organization, meaning that we engage young people, elders, family, young families, all aspects of the community in our work. That's a little bit about the organization. So with COVID-19, just a few points here. So the spread of the virus, it was worsened by pre-existing conditions in South Los Angeles. And I think Dr. Pastor has touched on some of these things. For example, overcrowding. I remember reading an article in the LA Times, and it was from the perspective of a physician who was working with a gentleman who had come in, seeking treatment for COVID. And she was doing a little bit of finger wagging at him, like, well, are you, following the basic protocols, the wearing a mask and social distancing? And he explained to her that in his home, he was living with his adult children who were frontline workers and having to go out into the community in spaces where they were being exposed to the virus, through the work and through customers, people coming in not wearing masks and so forth. And then that was how he had been exposed to the virus. And that, that there was 4 of them living in a 1-bedroom apartment. And so socially distancing or sheltering at home wasn't an option for him. And it was just, the physician was just kind of taken aback at this situation. And so it goes back to the point about, if you're not really talking to real people and really understanding the conditions, then you can kind of make these sweeping assumptions about what people are and aren't doing. Another piece for us was around underemployment. So folks with multiple jobs, not having the opportunity to work from home. And so that was also, people having to work around circumstances that are not in their control, going into risky settings and then putting people in their homes at risk. So I think Dr. Pastor touched on this too, like the tiers situation. It's great to have for elders to have access to vaccination, but if they're coming back home in a very cramped space with people who are being forced to go out into the workforce, then we also need those people to be vaccinated. We need people in those frontline jobs to be vaccinated. So so the spread of the virus was worsened by some pre-existing conditions. In turn, the virus also exacerbated deep problems that were already happening in South LA. So education, Dr. Pastor talked about, shifting to a virtual model. We were already experiencing deep gaps in academic achievement in our communities, right? And so that was already a problem that we were working to address. And so the fact that now kids have missed so much schooling, in our community, even when the shift to the virtual model took place, it took months sometimes for our kids to actually access virtual classroom because they didn't have the hardware, they didn't have the internet connectivity that they needed to do that on a regular basis. And it also exacerbating homelessness. Just with this pandemic, we know just before that, a lot of people were wondered, one crisis or one missed paycheck away from homelessness. And so this has just exacerbated some of those already existing problems. And just, again, to reiterate, just a devastating impact all around on physical, financial, and mental health. And I also wanted to drill down a little bit into the mental health piece. We actually instituted a teletherapy program at our organization for our staff to be able to access therapy with licensed therapists, people of color therapists. But just, the trauma that people are experiencing, I think that everyone is experiencing as a victim of this health crisis, this pandemic, but particularly in the African American community, that being also just contextualized with what's going on in the political arena. So having this impact, and then also at the same time, just all of these instances of state violence and just the consistent, abuse and murder of Black people at the hands of police is just another piece of what's going on right now that's devastating for mental health in the Black community. And so we did the teletherapy program, but we also have done some healing circles in local parks, which is really building on the community and how do we heal ourselves? How do we be in community and address our mental health in those ways? And so we tend to, do programs and projects that we feel like that can demonstrate what can be done by government or other institutions that could be helpful to address these crises. So I'll go on. So in terms of responses, what our organization's been able to do, I mentioned before that we're a community organizing institution. We don't do a lot of service delivery, but we sure did turn into a service provider in the wake of this pandemic. So we were able to do fundraising and to help purchase equipment and different things to give to our community members. So PPE, we partnered with our local city council office to help with the senior meals program. We were able to raise some money to do just direct cash relief payments to families. So to help cover rent, utilities, and other things. And then also giving out laptops and hardware to our students and families and hotspots, et cetera, for them to be able to just kind of get out of the deepest level of crisis and start to try to address this new way of living. Also on the vaccination piece, so we talked a little bit, or I've heard a discussion a little bit about the inequitable distribution and the way that the vaccines were rolled out. It's just just didn't make a lot of sense to us in terms of having overcrowded homes, multi-generational households, people having to go out and be frontline workers. And so what we would have liked to have seen is, can we take the vaccinations to people? Can we go into these businesses? Like, we're so concerned about everything reopening, like Dr. Pastor was saying, like, there's a certain group of people who are like, well, when can I go out and have dinner again? Like, and that's your main concern. But if we're if we want to have the economy open, if we want to be able to go to restaurants and so forth, then we should go to these businesses and vaccinate the people that are going to be working there. So we were approached by our county supervisor, Holly Mitchell, to do a vaccination clinic and to really bring our community organizing perspective to that. So, I mean, literally someone called us on a Friday and said, can you get this up by Monday? And we said, okay, we'll give it a shot. So we were able to actually facilitate a vaccination clinic at a local park. And we did that, and we were offering the Pfizer, so it was a 2-shot process. We were able to come up with an appointment system, because like Dr. Pastor was saying, you have to have all of these things in place to be able to even get a chance at getting one of these slots that were so coveted. And this was back in February. So we were able to create a system where people could sign up and actually get an appointment. Because prior to that, the expectation was that you would go and wait in line for who knows how long, and maybe not even be able to get a shot. And that just doesn't work for people in our communities, that you can't just take off from work. You could lose your job if you're going to do something like this. So we were able to do it.
Remember the speed.
Oh.
Remember the speed.
Mhm.
Slow down a little bit.
All right. So we were able to do an appointment system. And then also just the way that people were treated while they were waiting in line. We engaged them around their health, we talked to them about their families. And we were also doing a survey effort that I'll talk a little bit more about. Another phenomenon that we were seeing is vaccine chasers, and I heard someone call them vaccine colonizers, and we really liked that. And so we were seeing people from other communities, mostly white people, coming into the South LA, some of the South LA vaccination sites, and taking the doses that were meant for local residents. And so there's a mega site right next to our office here, and it was very surreal when I would come into the office in a Black and brown community, and to see lines of Teslas and Porsches and Range Rovers lined up in our community waiting to get these shots. And so it was just very jarring. And so when we did our site, we made sure that the link to register for the appointments, we didn't distribute it too widely, because we knew that if it got to message boards and sort of broader community, that there would be a danger of people coming in and getting the doses that were meant for Black and brown people in South LA. And so what we're seeing now, I think we're doing another vaccine clinic at another local park. We were able to shift the timing for this clinic, so it runs later into the evening, so that people who have jobs and can't come in the middle of the day, can have an opportunity to get vaccinated. What we're seeing now is a significant decrease in demand. And so our belief is that people who are ready to go, that wanted a vaccine, like they've gotten their shots, they're good to go. And so now we're experiencing, this vaccine resistance. And so again, we're using our community organizing toolkits to be able to motivate people to come get shots. And really what that looks like is hearing from a trusted messenger, which is often a family member or someone that you can really relate to, that looks like you, and saying, hey, I got it, I'm okay, I'm able to do X, Y, and Z with my family now, and please, encourage other people to do that. The next level of responses, so those were kind of like the individual level responses, but again, if we're looking at racism as the true pandemic, then we also need, just really deep and substantive investments in our community. So what Community Coalition has, we've partnered with some other community organizations and a labor union to put out some funding demands. So Los Angeles is getting upwards of $1 billion from the federal government. And so we wanted to be proactive in saying where we think that money should go. And so we've laid out a plan called Make Los Angeles Whole that calls for deep investment in family care and child care. So this Racial Justice Equity Fund for Women would give loans to women business owners to help support their businesses or nonprofits. Housing security, so helping people with rent and mortgage payments and utilities. Youth employment opportunities, a guaranteed basic income program, and a community-driven safety fund. And so we have put this plan out. It's pretty ambitious, it's pretty bold, but we feel like this is what we need to be calling for in terms of just broad interventions on the community level. And then the last piece is this COVID-19 Communities of Color Needs Assessment. We were partnering with Congressmember Bass. This was her idea, and she is partnering with Dr. Cheryl Grills at Loyola Marymount University out here in Los Angeles. But it's a nationwide assessment. We were able to We were the lead organization for Los Angeles County, and we got upwards of 3,000 folks to fill out the survey, Black and Brown people. And we should have the results in a few weeks. And we expect that this effort will help us, again, really assess what people's needs are, what the impact of COVID-19 has been on them. And we want to use that information to drive our campaigns and legislation moving forward.
Okay, wonderful, Leslie. I have a question here in my phone. Somebody texted me. And I think you can start, Leslie, and then I would also like to get Professor Pastor's reaction. And this is about connecting the traumas from the pandemic to violence within and between communities. How do we heal the anger inside communities and between communities? I mean, for example, we know that attacks against Asians have increased tremendously. And of course, this is yet another community that we haven't talked about yet. But how do you see that in the area that you cover, Leslie? Or do you see?
Violence among community?
Some of the trauma, is that creating violence, or is that creating tensions? Is that creating issues that you need to be addressing, or we need to be addressing as a larger community?
Absolutely. I think this time has been stressful in many different ways for all of us. We are seeing upticks in violence in South LA. We're seeing upticks in domestic violence. You can imagine, the sheltering at home and thinking about people who, and children as well, whose maybe their job or their school was their escape from a really, a terrible situation at home. And so the healing circles work that we've been doing has been helpful in our community. We also work very closely with gang interventionists. So people who have left the active gang lifestyle, but are still very well respected in their communities and are very helpful in stopping retaliation and helping to moderate disputes. They also work with the police, but they're able to bring in the police in ways that are helpful versus, sort of just increasing patrols or increasing people being pulled over. That's something that we don't want to see. We know that that police don't make our community safer. When you go into a community that you believe is safe, you don't see police driving everywhere. What you see is resources and activities and opportunity. And that's what we want in our communities, hence the call for investment. But I do believe that, this has been traumatic for folks. And so those community healing efforts are really important. And with funding and with having people in elected office that understand those kinds of interventions, we can really bring those to scale, because that's what we can't do. We can do, a handful of them with our limited resources, but we do that to show that, like, hey, this is something that works and it should be brought to scale with more resources from folks in power.
Professor Pastor, how do we heal the anger that targets other groups?
Well, there's a couple of questions there. I'll take them separately. The first, just to add to what Leslie said, so I agree with everything she said, but I want to return to this idea of the micro recession, which is that normally we would say, well, the economy went down, there's going to be more people who are in economically desperate circumstances, and as a result, we might expect more property crime. We might also expect more violence to result. What's important to realize again is that the job loss, the wage loss, the mental stress is really focused in very particular communities. So is it a surprise that the violence rate is up in South LA? No, not if you were paying attention to where the disease and economic stress has taken place. There, East Los Angeles, the Southeast cities, et cetera. The second thing, which I think is at least explicitly in your question, is also the anti-Asian violence that has been racking the country over the last year. And I think that that's a function of two things. One is the previous administration's attempt to stir up hate and resentment and blame the pandemic on China rather than on our own lack of preparation, unwillingness to wear masks, and inability to develop a testing regime that made sense. And then I think that when times are hard, people look for scapegoats. And so they're easily tempted by scapegoats that are being lifted up in front of them. And the task of leadership is to help people move away from the lowest common denominator to the highest common ground. And we've been lacking that nationally until this recent change. And you could see Biden trying to do what he can to move people in a very different direction. And I think it's been a kind of surprising breath of fresh air. I think most of us, I mean, I said the other day, you know, part of this breath of fresh air may be real, but it's also the case that when you've been in a racist desert for 4 years, when something pops up, it could be an oasis or it could be an illusion. And the thing that we need to do is to make sure that the sudden attention to racial equity and policy in COVID, and the fact that the president talked about anti-Asian violence immediately, the fact that after as soon as the jury was sequestered, he gave his opinion on Derek Chauvin. Those are all really positive signs, but we can't be too hopeful. We need to hold the administration's feet to the fire because again, Trump definitely lowered our expectations about what national leadership looks like. When you've got a xenophobic, racist, raving lunatic in charge of the country, the bar gets pretty low.
Oh, here's another
Not that I have an opinion.
No, you don't. No, neither do we. Henrietta, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Pilar. How will this inequality and inequity be addressed financially at county, state, and federal government levels? The president issued his American Rescue Plan, and it seems like we need a Marshall Plan for Black and Brown communities. So what can be expected on all these three levels in terms of providing resources to Black and Brown communities?
For both.
Oh, please for both, because Leslie, maybe you can talk about the plan that's been proposed by Community Coalition and the community allies. I think at the federal level, we see signs of hope. My understanding is that the current National Restaurant Relief is they've opened up the window, but the first people to be let in the door are restaurants that are owned by people of color and women and veterans and disabled people. So they're understanding the gaps that emerged in earlier programs. I think that there's a unfortunate limit to we should be pushing the federal government to do more to address inequality. There's a bit of a limit there, which has to do with both the national politics and federal law, which means that there's a lot of opportunities at the state and local level to steer the way that money gets spent, to make sure that it actually goes into the communities that have been the most disenfranchised. And I know that one of the efforts is one led by Community Coalition, full disclosure, I'm on the board, that is trying to take the $1.5 billion that the city is going to get, and to make sure that it goes into addressing not just COVID disparities, but the underlying disparities that led these communities to be so vulnerable. Leslie, can you say a word about that?
Sure. So we've put a plan together. I went over the points. There was one on one of the slides called "Make Los Angeles Whole." So we felt that it was really important to be proactive and put out our demands and how we wanted to see the money spent before the mayor and other folks started to weigh in. We wanted to kind of set the tone for the conversation. What we're asking for is bold. And I think we have to be bold, knowing that there's going to be negotiations that have to take place, and the political maneuverings that they're going to take place. So we've put out this demand. We are working with individual council members to try our best to get the votes that we need for these things to pass. We're a community organizing institution and a member-based institution. So our members are like everyday residents of South LA. And so we've put out these demands. We will do our best to assert our people power in getting the votes needed. And then afterwards, when the chips fall where they may, we will do an assessment of who supported our plan and who didn't, and look at an electoral strategy for 2022. Who are the folks that are up for re-election? Who are the folks that are not representing the needs of our community? And we will be working on them. We have a sister organization, the Community Coalition Action Fund, where we can have more freedom with being more explicit about electoral work. And we will look at who supported this and who didn't, and assert our voices and say, if you're not going to do the will of the people, then we will need to be voting someone else into your position.
And the footnote I would add to that is that I'm on the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors, and so we've been talking about these kinds of issues, and I was talking about them on the Jobs and Business Task Force. I think one really, really critical thing to do is to break down every barrier to undocumented Californians being able to access relief, job training, et cetera. This is a pretty good example of federal versus state. Federally, federal funds, very hard for undocumented people to access. But that means that every state training program, that every state relief program should try to think about what it can do to be fully accessible to undocumented Californians. Part of where journalists can help is to make sure that people understand what this population is. When people think of undocumented immigrants, they think of people who are recently arrived and maybe have a light attachment to the country. But as many of you know, the undocumented immigrant population in the United States peaked in 2007. It's been in decline ever since, not because of the Trump presidency, but for a number of different reasons we can get into. But what that means is that in California, more than 2/3 of undocumented immigrants have been in the country for longer than a decade. They have lots of mixed status families. They're deeply embedded in businesses and in communities. And we need to stop saying, and I just said it, undocumented immigrants, and start talking about undocumented Californians. They are part of who we are. And when we see them that way, we want to open up programs because we know that they'll be with us for the long haul.
We know we have to say goodbye, but I'm going to pass it to Sandy because she has a last question for both.
Oh, thank you. I just very much valued both your presentations. My last question is what both of you think about calls for reinstating what we had in the Depression, the equivalent of a draft, a youth-related public service, public workforce draft that would be focused on giving young people a sense of purpose, but also a sense of working together, of being in it together. This was like the public works program of the Depression. Do either of you feel either California or the country as a whole could institute some form of public work service requirement for young people?
I have to jump for my next thing, so Leslie, if you don't mind, I'll go first. I don't probably support a draft because of the involuntary nature of it, but I would definitely support a massive expansion, for example, of the California Conservation Corps, so that we could go beyond the wilderness and start to retrofit low-income housing so that it's more climate resistant, that we could address environmental inequities, that we could create real opportunities for job training for people to be able to move into employment. I would also support something that would encourage public service, particularly for higher income individuals. And I say this because I think, when people talk about how the economy is splitting into two, and then there's these concentrations of poverty, and that's bad because when there's a concentration of poverty, there are challenges that we all know with schools that may not function and lack of investment, et cetera. I think there's also a problem with a concentration of affluent people, because when affluent people are concentrated together, they wind up telling themselves stories about how deserving they are of their positions. And I think there's something about giving affluent people a chance to do service in poor communities that helps to break that consciousness and make all of us aware of how lucky we are if we're lucky enough to have done well in this life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
I'm
much,
sure that
Manuel.
Leslie will say something brilliant now.
Thank you. Bye. Okay, Leslie, close it down.
Yeah.
Last word.
I'll just add that what we've advocated for from our local government is this no less than $100 million investment in youth employment opportunities. And so I think that is something that government entities can invest in. We would love to see that being also connected to local civic service organizations, so that the work and the training and the learning is being done in a local community where you can also be giving back in that space and learning hard skills at the same time. And then also we just need life skills and like life management programs as well for our young people, financial management, financial literacy, things like that we sometimes used to get in our schools, but are definitely not available any longer. So that's what we would be advocating for.
Thank you so much, Leslie.
Sure.
Sandy, you want to close?
No, just thank you both for a fascinating hour. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.